Chapter 5 of Grace Harlowe's Plebe Year at High School. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine Blashford. Grace Harlowe's Plebe Year at High School by Jessie Graham Flower. Chapter 5. Anne Has a Secret. On the night of the flying machine exhibition, the four chums, for Anne had now been formally adopted by Grace and her friends, arrived somewhat early at the great arched doorway leading into the gymnasium. They were all somewhat excited over this new experience. There had been many balloon ascensions at the State Fair, and once a dirigible airship had sailed over the town of Oakdale, but to see a real flying machine with all its grace and elegance and lightness was like stepping onto another planet where progress had advanced much faster than it had on this. At least so thought Anne as she followed her friends into the building. There was a sound of puffing and churning, during which David arrived in a cloud of smoke on his motorcycle. "I mean to learn to ride one of those queer machines," exclaimed Grace from the doorway, never dreaming what an important part that very machine was one day to play in the history of Oakdale. "All right, you're welcome to," replied David, jumping off as he stopped the motor. "Come over to the campus tomorrow afternoon and I'll give you your first lesson." "Is that really an invitation?" asked Grace, "for I shall accept it if it is." "It certainly is," answered the young man, "and I shall expect you to make a very excellent prize pupil, not like Reddy Brooks, who tumbled off and smashed his nose because he suddenly forgot how to manage the brakes." A few other people gathered in the roomy gymnasium to see the exhibition, but the girls could see that it was a very exclusive company they had been invited to join. There were, in fact, no other girls except Miriam Nesbit, who came late with her mother, a handsome, quiet woman to whom her son David bore a marked resemblance. Grace and her friends spoke to Mrs. Nesbit cordially, while Miriam bowed coldly and confined all her attentions to Miss Leece, the unpopular teacher of mathematics. Miriam ignored Anne entirely. "And now, ladies, if you will all be seated, the show will begin," announced David, leading them to the spectators' benches ranged against the wall. "Don't expect anything wonderful of mine," he added. "It's only in the first stages so far. I'm afraid she'll break down, but she's a great little machine just the same, isn't she, Mother?" "She is wonderful, I think, David," replied Mrs. Nesbit, who was a very shy, quiet woman, almost entirely wrapped up in her only son. Miriam had always been too much for her, and she had long since given up attempting to rule or direct her brilliant, willful daughter. "Mrs. Nesbit," said Grace, "this is Anne Pierson, one of the brightest girls in the freshman class." "How do you do?" said Mrs. Nesbit cordially, giving the girl her hand. "You are a newcomer, are you not? I haven't heard Miriam speak of you." "She is a newcomer, Mother, but I hear she's giving your daughter Miriam a stiff pull for first place," said David teasingly. "I wish you'd keep quiet, David," exclaimed his sister angrily. "You always talk too much." "Miriam," remonstrated her mother. "Miss Nesbit," said Miss Leece in a disagreeable, harsh voice, "will have no trouble, I think, in holding her own." The teacher gave Anne such a glare from her pale blue eyes that the poor child shrank behind Grace in embarrassment. "Dear, dear," murmured Mrs. Nesbit helplessly. She disliked exceedingly the scenes to which her daughter often subjected the family. David only laughed good-naturedly. "The exhibition is about to begin," he said, and disappeared into the room where the ships were to be put through their performances. In a few moments 6 young airship builders appeared, each carrying in his arms the result of his summer's labors. There was vigorous applause from everybody except Miriam, who was too angry with her brother to enjoy the spectacle. The aeroplanes were all copies of well-known models, except David's, which was of an entirely new and original design of his own invention. It looked something like a flying fish, the girls thought, with its slender oblong body, gauzy fins at the sides, and a funny little forked tail at the stern. The models were too light for machinery, so rubber bands, secured crisscross in the bows, when suddenly released with a snap, gave the little ships the impetus they needed to fly the length of the gymnasium. Only 4 of the 6, however, were destined to fly that evening. They soared straight down the big room as easily and gracefully as great white birds, and dropped gently when they hit the curtain at the other end, their builders running after them as eagerly as boys sailing kites. One of the models fluttered and settled down before it reached the other side, and David's machine, which had commanded most attention because it was different, started out bravely enough, its little propeller making a busy humming as it skimmed along. But it had gone hardly 10 yards before it collapsed and ignominiously crashed to the floor. "I'm glad of it," said Miriam above the din, for everyone had gathered about the young man to offer sympathy and congratulations at the same time. "It's very, very clever, my boy," said Professor Blitz, "and you'll succeed yet if you keep at it." "She wouldn't go far, David," said Grace, stroking the little model as if it had been a pet dog, "but she's the prettiest of all just the same." "Did it hurt it when it fell?" Anne asked him. "I think it broke one of its little fins," laughed David. "It hurt me much more than itself, because it wouldn't be good and fly all the way." "Anne," called Grace, "here is someone looking for you. It's a boy with a note." Anne looked frightened as she opened a soiled-looking envelope the boy handed her. "Is anything the matter?" asked Jessica, seeing the expression of fear on her face. "No, yes," answered poor little Anne undecidedly. "I must go home, or rather, I mustn't go the way I came. Don't you think I could leave at a side entrance? I don't want to see the person who is waiting for me in front." "Of course, child," spoke up Grace. "We'll see you home ourselves, won't we, girls?" "Wait until I lock up my motorcycle and I'll go along," called David. "We'll all protect Miss Anne." "Tell him," said Anne to the boy, putting the note back in the envelope and giving it to him, "that what he asks is impossible." "Couldn't you squeeze us into the carriage, Mother?" asked David, returning presently with his hat. "I have invited Miss Leece to drive home with us, Mother," interrupted Miriam, giving her brother a blighting glance. "There is room for only one more person. Perhaps Jessica will take it." "You are very kind," said Jessica coldly, "but I prefer to walk with the girls." "You'd better walk too, Crosspatch, and learn a few manners from your friends," was David's parting advice to his sister. "Children, children!" exclaimed Mrs. Nesbit. "Don't, I beg of you, quarrel in public." Presently the 5 young people had slipped out of a side door of the gymnasium and started down a back street in the direction of Anne's house. They had not gone far, however, before they became aware that they were being followed. Grace was the first to call the attention of Nora and Jessica to a long, slim figure stealing after them in the shadows. "Here he comes," whispered Jessica. "What in the world do you suppose he wants with our poor little Anne?" "I believe he's going to stop us," returned Grace. "He is coming nearer and nearer." "Anne, I command you to wait," called a voice from behind them. They all stopped suddenly, and Anne jumped as though she had received a shock. A tall, theatrical-looking individual had come up to them. He wore a shabby frock coat and a black slouch hat, which he raised with an elaborate flourish when he saw the young girls. "Pardon me, ladies," he said, "but I wish to speak with my daughter." Anne controlled herself with an effort. "I cannot see you now, father," she said. "It is quite late, and I must get back." "You shall not only speak to me, but you shall come with me," exclaimed the man with a sudden flare of anger. "I will not submit to disobedience again. Come at once." "Father, I cannot go with you," cried Anne, clinging to her friends. "I would rather be with Mother and Mary. They need me more than you do, and I want to go to school and study to be a teacher." The man was now beside himself with theatrical rage. "Miserable child," he cried, waving his arms wildly. "I shall take you if I must by force." Breaking through the group, he seized the hand of his daughter and dragged her after him. "Oh, save me!" cried the poor girl, struggling to release herself. "I can't stand this. If she doesn't want to go with him, she shan't, father or no father," growled David, dashing after the pair. "Stop, sir!" he cried, seizing Anne's other hand. "I must ask you to release this young lady at once." "Insolent boy!" cried the other, giving each word an oratorical flush. "Are you not aware that this young lady, as you call her, is merely a child, and that she happens to be my daughter? I cannot see that you have a right to interfere in a family matter." "But I have no proof that Miss Pierson is your daughter," retorted David. "It is enough that she doesn't want to go with you. I undertook to see her safely to her own home this evening, and I mean to do it. After that you may settle your difficulties as you please." "Miserable upstart!" cried the man, now so thoroughly angry that he let go Anne's hand. "I have a good mind to give you what you deserve. As for you, undutiful, wretched girl," he added, his voice rising to an emotional tremolo, "you shall be well punished for this." "Don't wait," whispered Anne. "If we run, we can get away now while he is so angry." At that they all took to their heels, David following after them, much relieved to have given Anne's father the slip without further disagreeable argument. No one spoke until they had reached the Pierson cottage and had seen Anne safely to the front door. "I'm so sorry," she exclaimed at last, trying not to cry. "I wouldn't for anything have had it happen, and just when you were all beginning to like me a little. Will you forgive me?" "Forgive you, Anne?" cried Grace. "It wasn't your fault. We are only awfully sorry for you." "We will just forget all about it and never speak of it to anyone," promised Jessica, taking the girl's hand kindly. "But I want you to understand that I was right in not going," protested Anne. "Some day I will explain." "Of course you were right," said David, "and I hope you will never be persuaded to go." "Thank you all 1,000 times," came gratefully from Anne, "and good night." Then she disappeared into the cottage. "Well, this was a night's adventure," observed Grace as they started homeward. "I'm afraid Anne's father is a night's adventurer," muttered David. "He looks mightily like one of those strolling actors who go barnstorming through country towns." "Poor Anne, do you suppose he wants her to barnstorm?" asked Nora. "I haven't a doubt of it," replied the young man. "I think you girls had better adopt that poor child and look after her." "We have already," answered Grace. "Didn't Miriam tell you about it?" "Miriam? No, she never tells me anything. Besides, what has she to do with it?" The girls were silent. "By the way," continued Grace, Speaking of barnstorming, we want to ask your advice, David. The sophomores played a mean trick on us the other day at the old omnibus house." "I heard something about the Black Monks of Asia," answered David, laughing. "Can't your inventive brain devise a scheme of revenge?" went on Grace. "If we don't get even with them soon, the story will be all over town." "Well," replied David, "I can tell you a secret I happened to have overheard when one of the sophomores was calling on Miriam. I was an eavesdropper entirely by accident, but what I heard might help some. The sophomores are going to give an initiation mask ball a week from Saturday night. Only the class and a few outsiders, among them Miriam, are to be present. Everybody is to be in fancy dress and disguised out of all recognition. Can't you work up a scheme with that to go upon, girls?" "We certainly can," cried Nora. "It's the chance of a lifetime." "Just wait and see," exclaimed Grace. "By the way, David, you didn't happen to overhear the password, did you?" asked Jessica. "I did," he replied. "Nothing escaped me, for I was caught in a trap. You know I don't care for that large, husky young damsel who leads the sophomores, and if I had made my presence behind the screen known, I should have had to speak to her. So I just sat still and said nothing. The password is Asia." "They are trying to rub it in, I suppose," cried Grace, "but I think they won't be so ready to use that word after their old ball is over." "If you want any help," offered David as he left Grace at her front door, "you know where to come for it, don't you?" "You're a true brick, David," said Grace. "Good night." End of chapter 5.